But welcome again. My name is Ashley Klein Jimenez. I am with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Prevent Connect. You are joining us for Back to Basics, Preventing Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence. Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The information provided in this web conference does not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government or CalCASA. So our objectives today are pretty straightforward. We want to be able to define primary prevention in as plain of language as we possibly can. We also want to describe some examples of prevention in the real world and then help identify some resources if you are interested in expanding your prevention knowledge. Tori, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk a little bit about kind of the process that we went through in determining how to talk about prevention on this web conference.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So if you all, for those of you who've been on Prevent Connect web conferences before, you'll see this slide and know that this is also a note of personal accountability for me, as I frequently tend to be someone who uses a lot of jargony words. So I actually have asked one of our CalCASA colleagues to start something similar to a swear jar for me today, but instead of swearing, it's jargon. So that will help hold me accountable to, you know, what we're really talking about on this web conference today. So we made a little word cloud of these jargony words and acronyms that we often use a lot when we're describing prevention. And as folks are reading what's on the screen, I really encourage you to go to the text chat and let us know which of these words, which of these phrases did you fully understand and know what it means your very first day in this field of preventing sexual and intimate partner violence. So the goal of this web conference today, what Ashley and I are striving for in this web conference, is to talk about what it means to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence before it occurs without using anything related to jargon. I see folks are pointing out that public is on here quite a few times. Word clouds, I don't know how to have like phrases stick with each other on word clouds. So that is why you see that a lot on there when talking about public health. So our goals are to not use these super jargony terms today. We want to make prevention more accessible and also realize that prevention came from grassroots organizing. The field has been really professionalized when we recognize it as a personal field, looking to connect others for a common goal.
I was just like,
And when we use things like acronyms and scholarly language, we tend to drive people away from our movement and our goal, and that inhibits us from reaching all who are interested in preventing violence. It also can replicate some harmful norms that folks may recognize as elitism, and that also drives people away from our goal and from prevention. The point of today's web conference is that it shouldn't take a master's degree to understand and explain what prevention is. It shouldn't take any degree. We should be able to talk about prevention the way we see it and the way it exists. And a way that, you know, we kind of think about framing this web conference is, how would you explain this work to your family? Thinking of young children in your life. Me thinking of trying to explain this to my parents. Sometimes they're like, oh, I know that you work at a computer all day. I don't know what you do beyond that. So how would you explain prevention to folks in your life? And Ashley, I'm going to move ahead and ask folks to think about this a little bit more and respond in the text chat. What does prevention look like to you? When you're telling the story of prevention, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? what does prevention look like to you? And I see folks are responding, trying to stop violence before it happens, stopping the act before it happens, changing culture, making our community safer, a world without violence, ways to keep people safe, changing norms. Wow, these are coming in really fast. Ashley, do you have anything to add on this slide as people are responding? I do want to let you know, I see that your icon is muted, so you may need to adjust that so we can hear you.
Thanks, Tori. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I love all of these responses. I think they're so great. They're so much a part of what we're talking about. And Tori, if you would move to the next slide, you know, like I said, I love these responses. And to me, you know, a lot of what people are saying is really resonating with what prevention means to me. I think one thing that I've been really thinking about is that when I think about prevention, it means that we're providing and promoting opportunities for communities to live their best lives. We're creating environments where everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And this includes a lot of things, right? Like we need a lot of things in order for that to happen. And it includes the presence of certain things, and it also includes the absence of certain things. And I think what's really great is that when we think of prevention in terms of creating spaces where people are able to live their lives in the most healthy, safe, and secure ways, then we can find examples of prevention really all over. Prevention is happening in communities and in organizations that may not use the term. And I wanted to share an example of, you know, what I mean by that. So I used to live in a city where the utility department had a program that provided free trees twice a year to neighborhoods in order to create tree canopies that would then reduce energy needs. And some neighborhoods would organize teams to plant the trees around the neighborhoods. And this would result in an opportunity for neighbors to meet each other and become more connected to the community that they lived in. And, you know, the utility department and the neighborhood. All right, I'm back. I'm so sorry, everyone. Got kicked out. I'm not sure where what you last heard from me, but what I was trying to convey to you was, you know, I lived in this city where the utility department would provide free trees to neighborhoods, and the point of this was really to create tree canopies. To be able to reduce energy needs. And some of the neighborhoods would organize teams to plant trees around the neighborhoods. And this really resulted in opportunities for neighbors to meet each other and for people to feel more connected to their communities. And, you know, the utility department and even the neighborhood tree planting teams probably would never describe this program or these events as a strategy to prevent violence. And, you know, the program alone probably wouldn't prevent violence either. But it's an example of creating situations where communities were engaged and connected. And we know that that can have a positive impact. Give me 1 second while I move ahead. All right, it looks like I lost my co-facilitator. So let me share my screen so you all can see slides again. Give me just a minute, appreciate your patience. Yeah, thanks, Carlene. I mean, it's definitely not something that we would maybe typically think of as violence prevention, But again, if we're thinking about prevention as being kind of broadly ways to connect people and make spaces safer, there are examples like this all over the place. All right, here I go. I'm gonna share my screen. I promise it's coming. Thank you all for your patience. Let's see. Okay. Let me. Sorry, everyone. Just give me 1 second. Okay. I think I'm good. Appreciate your patience. So one of the reasons, as Tori was explaining, that we wanted to host this web conference is because we really do believe that the concept of prevention needs to be accessible. It shouldn't, as Tori said, it shouldn't take some, kind of degree or a job where you specifically are working in prevention to be able to engage people in prevention. People are saying that they can see presenter mode. I think, let me see if I can help you with what you're all seeing. Sorry, this is why it's always important to have multiple people helping you, but it's hard when Wi-Fi doesn't always work. Oops. Give me 1 second, everyone. Let me try to reconfigure. I'm working on multiple screens, so it's also hard to know what I'm looking at and what you all are looking at.
Hey, remember how I said getting a new modem was going to fix all my internet problems? That was funny.
I do.
That was very funny. I can try sharing my screen again. I hooked up to a mobile hotspot. So if that would help you, we can try that and see what happens for the next 30 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome to our imperfect humanness.
All right. Can folks let us know in the text chat, are they seeing the full screen that they're supposed to be seeing? All right, I'm seeing yeses. Thanks, y'all. Thank you for your patience and your grace. Ashley, I'm gonna hand it back to you.
All right, thank you. I don't see any screen now, but I'm just gonna go with it. So anyways, I think what I was saying is, why are we going back to basics? Well, we can't prevent violence without being able to bring more people along. And sometimes the language that we use that I think was really represented well in the word cloud that Tori put up, it doesn't necessarily mean anything to most people, right? It just doesn't mean anything unless you're actually, like working in violence prevention specifically. But, I always think about imagine like the amount of change that we could make if people across communities, across employment sectors, across nonprofits, across government offices, across, different industries, the entertainment industries, sports. Imagine if all of those people got on board with preventing violence. Like, imagine kind of the strides that we could make. And Tori, will you go to the slide, the old picture of myself on it and my mom? So this is, it's interesting that I chose to get a little bit personal with you all on a web conference that seems to have so many technical issues. But I did want to share that, personally, I've been thinking about sexual violence prevention for a really long time. Before I had the words, before I knew what it meant, my mom was a survivor of child sexual abuse. And this was something that I knew pretty much growing up, the whole time from my earliest memories, I knew that that was part of her story. And part of the reason why I knew that was because I would listen to her bravely tell her story to family and to friends of ours. And I knew that she, from hearing her tell her story, never received the support or care that she really deserved. And the trauma that she experienced in childhood had a really profound impact on her. And unfortunately, she continued to experience violence throughout her life. It wasn't just child sexual abuse, but she also was a survivor of intimate partner violence. And, the point that I'm really trying to make is from a really young age, I knew that my mom had experienced something really awful. And even though she did everything she could to do to heal, some of those things ended up causing even more harm to her. And I remember, being a kid and blaming a lot of the hardships that my siblings and I experienced growing up on the sexual abuse that happened to my mom. I remember thinking as a little kid, what would my mom's life be like if that hadn't happened to her, if she had never been abused? And I think, maybe more selfishly, I would also think, what would my life be like if my mom had never been abused? And so my mom's story and knowing this about my mom led me to becoming a rape crisis advocate. And I loved being able to support survivors in their healing, but I also knew that my mom was the kind of person that would never get support from a rape crisis center. And so my mind always went back to wonder if it hadn't happened in the first place, what would her life have been like? So I also want to tell you that my mom passed away 9 years ago. And, I still wonder how things could have been different, even including her death, if child sexual abuse hadn't been part of her story, if it could have been prevented. And so, Tori, I think you still have control of our slides, but if you would go to the next slide, I want to encourage you all to think about what is your personal path to prevention? Like, what is it about preventing violence that really speaks to you? And, I'm not expecting anyone to get personal in the text chat, but, maybe there's a piece of paper near you, and you could maybe jot down what is your personal path to prevention? Sometimes I think when we talk about back to basics, it really means like, why am I here? Why do I care about prevention? So I want to give you just a couple minutes to maybe jot something down. If it feels safe and supportive for you to share anything in the chat, of course, we invite you to do so, but whatever feels safe and supportive for you. Thank you all so much for letting me share that.
Thank you, Ashley, for sharing that with everyone, and folks are sharing that gratitude in the chat and reflecting on their own experiences too. Want to take a moment and have some facilitator transparency here. I am going to, while folks are reflecting, sharing in the chat if that feels safe and supportive, or just reflecting on your own scratch paper or scratch document, whatever you're reflecting on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Our colleague, John Finley, has been so kind as to offer to share the slides for us today and move through those, so I don't have to run up my data bill. So I'm going to stop sharing as people are reflecting on what their personal path to prevention is, allowing folks a little bit more time to reflect on that while we get resituated over here.
Great, thanks Tori, and thanks John for having our back. I just want to thank you. I'm seeing people sharing that they've had similar thoughts about experiences in their lives. That Alexa said, I realized at a young age that a lot of opportunities depend on the community you live in, which is absolutely tied to prevention. I also want to share that even though my mom's not with us earthside any longer, she did talk openly about her story. And so before I share it, I always kind of check in with myself, like, would my mom be okay with me sharing this? But, you know, she thought that the work that rape crisis centers were doing and just anyone that was engaged in violence prevention was so important. And so, yeah, I just, again, want to thank you all for listening and for taking a moment to kind of think about your path to prevention. So John, will you go to our slide that has a lovely image of a river? So many of you have probably heard this story. This is really an old public health story that we talk about the way we should be thinking about sexual violence with, and a lot of people refer to it as the moving upstream story. Like I said, it's probably familiar to a lot of you, but you know, I've heard it told a lot of times over the years, and everyone tells it just slightly different, which, you know, I think that's part of storytelling, right? And I actually recently heard one of my colleagues, at Calcasa, Sarah Orton, she told it in a way that I really liked. So I'm going to borrow a little bit from the way that she tells her story. And the story goes like this. So one day, a person is fishing by the river and they see someone being swept downstream. This person is in the water is taking them downstream, and so the fisher jumps in to save the drowning person and successfully is able to drag them to safety on the shore of the river. But not even minutes later, another person comes floating down the river, also drowning and also calling out for help. And so the fisher is able to save this person too. But before they even have a chance to kind of sit down and dry themselves off and catch their breath, here comes another person, and then 3 more people, and on and on and on. And so at this point, the fisher is just exhausted and out of breath and is realizing that they can't possibly go on like this, right? They can't keep jumping into the river and pulling people to safety. So they decide to go upstream, to walk up and see, you know, why are all these people falling into the river? And so when the fisher finally gets upstream, they notice that it's pretty much a disaster zone. There are bridges that are just falling apart. There are people pushing other people into the river. There's just kind of a lot of reasons why people would fall in. It's not just one issue, it's many issues. And so the fisher, you know, is thinking to themselves, the only way to save all of these drowning people is to address all these issues that I see, to prevent people from falling in the first place. So that's a story that, and Michael says I just referenced the story in a meeting earlier. So it's really, really helpful in getting people to, you know, kind of see what we mean by primary prevention. That by the time someone is already drowning, yes, we have to save them. Absolutely. That's so important. But is that sustainable? Are there going to be people that get swept past us that we're not able to save? And John, if you would go to the next slide. So when I was first learning about prevention, you know, that story really helped me understand that, like I said, it's super incredibly important to save the drowning people, but it's not necessarily sustainable. And there's going to be people that we're not going to be able to get to in time. And we can't only be pulling people out of the water, right? We have to be doing other things. And so in sexual violence prevention, we talk about the different kind of forms that prevention can take on. So using this metaphor of the river, you know, we can provide advocacy to survivors. We can raise awareness about sexual violence and give them information about all of the resources that are available. We can think of ways for people to reduce their risk of being sexually assaulted. And we can actually try to stop it from even being an option for behavior in the first place. So if we think about our moving upstream story, you know, advocacy might look like the fisher being willing to go into the water and save those drowning people. Outreach and awareness might be posting signs to let people know that, hey, you know, a mile up the riverbank, there's a broken bridge. Risk reduction might be teaching people how to swim and giving them like floating devices. Primary prevention, though, would be actually fixing the bridge. And, really the best option would be to do all of these things, right? To think of ways where we can do all of those things, but fixing the bridge is likely going to have the biggest impact. It would also take the most time. And in sexual violence prevention, that's true too. Primary prevention takes time. And sometimes because of that, it can seem kind of out of reach to people and is often, not invested in as much as some of the other forms that prevention could take. It's not necessarily seen as important because we are faced with so many people in crisis in front of us. So, and thanks, I saw Tori posted a great resource from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, their prevention education boot camp. Thank you for doing that. Tori, I'm actually going to pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Ashley, and thank you for walking us through that moving upstream story. I see folks in the chat are saying that they really appreciate the moving upstream analogy. It really resonates with folks. So, John, if you could move to the next slide, please. We're going to continue on this analogy for a little bit, specifically looking at the bridge part of the moving upstream story. So in order to start thinking about the ways that we can prevent violence from occurring, the analogy in the story being prevent people from falling into the river, we need to look at how did the bridge get broken. And there are many different factors that contribute to violence, same as, many different factors that can contribute to the bridge being broken in our moving upstream analogy. But we're going to focus on social norms here for a second. And when we talk about social norms that contribute to violence, it can be, really informative to also think about how can we change those social norms? What are some of those specific activities or actions we can be doing to alter social norms that have this huge encompassing impact on the way that people live their lives? So that being said, that social norms are a major contributor to why violence occurs, and they can also be a great impact on preventing violence from happening in the first place. Ashley, I did just see Lori ask, can you repeat the example of risk reduction in the moving upstream story?
I was just typing to Lori, but yeah, so in the moving upstream story, risk reduction might look like teaching people how to swim and maybe providing them with like some type of floating device.
Thanks, Ashley. So looking at how did the bridge get broken, you can see on the screen there are many social norms that contribute to violence. Social norms that uphold a culture of violence, those being rigid gender roles, aggression and violence, and abuse of power, sexual violence as a private problem, acceptance of violence as a norm, and sex shaming and negativity. So when we address norms, it's super important because we have that opportunity to shift the culture from one that normalizes violence to one that protects against it. And John, if you could move to the next slide. It's not just enough for us to know, what are the social norms, but to know how did they come to be this way in the first place? Why is this something that we all have to navigate? How did these come to be in our culture? How did these come to be the norms that we live with? So one way to understand the problem is we need to understand what it is. And that can include identifying the different dynamics that impact different types of sexual violence. As folks were sharing in the chat, and as I'm sure folks can identify, is that when we say sexual violence, that is an umbrella term for so many types of violence and harm that can happen to people. And there are different dynamics at play for each of those, which also means that there are slightly different ways that we can prevent that and different social norms that can be altered in order to prevent various forms of violence. When we also think about, going back to our analogy, how is the bridge broken, we can also think about how many people are being impacted and how are they being impacted. We know there are a variety of factors that change how people are impacted by violence that they experience or are impacted by different risks of violence too. So when we're looking at getting to know the problem, we're really, digging deeper into how violence is occurring in different ways and how it's affecting people differently too. John, if I could have you move to the next slide, please. And finally, we start to think about, how do we repair the bridge? How do we protect against the problem? How do we create social norms and systems that, even if folks never walked across the bridge, didn't know the bridge existed, it still impacts them in a positive way of keeping people healthy, safe, and secure in their communities. So once we can identify the problem and we know how it's impacting people in different ways, we can take steps to build stronger bridges and to protect against violence, to prevent violence in our communities. And these are just a sampling of ways that we can do that through improving safety in schools, which looks different in different schools and different environments. And we'll walk through some examples later that talk about changing policy and connecting with community members as well. Ashley, did you have anything to add before we bring this back to our audience for a second?
I don't think so, Tori. I think we should hear from our audience.
Great. John, I'll have you move to the next slide, please. So we've been talking about sexual violence prevention in the frame of the moving upstream story, and building off this analogy to talk about broken bridges. So for folks in the text chat, let us know, what do you identify as broken bridges in your communities, and what do you think needs to be repaired? What do you think is needed in order to repair the broken bridges in your communities? Broken bridges being things that contribute to violence. So I'll give folks a second to think about some of that. Think about where this fits in their analogy. Lexi is saying a normalization of rape culture on campus, historical trauma, toxic masculinity, lack of trust. Some folks are bringing up some system level things that are normalized that place blame on victims, lack of community connectedness. Great. Folks are really doing a great job identifying what broken bridges are in their communities. And I really appreciate that. We're gonna let people continue to answer in the text chat, and we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about what we mean by root causes. So John, if you can bring us to the next slide, please. Thanks. Ashley and I were in a super analogy and metaphor mood when making these slides. So we are going to go to one of our other favorite metaphors when talking about violence prevention, and that is when we talk about root causes, what are we talking about? So I really like using this metaphor to talk about preventing violence before it occurs, because I feel like what's shown on the screen with the causes being down at the root and symptoms being out at the leaves is a great metaphor to delineate between the things that we readily see that are symptoms of violence, but that sometimes people can, misidentify those as causes of violence because it's what we can more easily see. But we know, working in the field of prevention, or just being passionate about preventing violence, we have to dig deeper and address the causes of violence in order to prevent the symptoms from showing up. So we want to get down to the root so we don't have these leaves of symptoms of violence that continue to occur. And, you know, I think a really great example of this metaphor in action has to do with some things that we see when people blame victims for their experiences of violence. And I often think of how the way that I see this manifest a lot is when people are talking about clothing, saying that someone's clothing is the reason why that they experienced violence, and misidentifying that as a cause, when really saying that someone's clothing caused them to experience violence is a symptom of the root cause of a culture of violence that has really strict gender norms, has really strict norms around expression, and that has norms around who has power and authority and entitlement in our culture. So I like to use that as an example because it also shapes the way that we think about prevention. If people are only looking at the symptoms and not the causes, in my example of clothing, people can easily look at, if they are only looking at symptoms, they can look and say, clothing is causing violence to occur. So therefore, I'm going to enact a dress code or police the way that people are expressing themselves through clothing on their own bodies. But we know that that's not doing anything to get to the root cause of violence, to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. So instead of focusing on the symptoms, we want to take a shift and dig deeper and look at the causes of violence, what's in our social norms, our culture, and our systems that are allowing these symptoms of violence, these leaves of violence to sprout out. So Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk more specifically about what these root causes are.
Thanks, Tori. I appreciate that. And John, if you would go to the next slide. So something that I saw a lot come up in the text chat in response to our last question, people were really identifying oppression as a root cause. And what's on the screen is a tool that I came across years ago. Many of you may have also come across this tool, but it really helped me be able to make the connection that oppression is a root cause of sexual violence. And so this is a sexual violence continuum that Lydia Guy Ortiz created back in 2006. And in the tool, there are a range of sexually violating behaviors that are depicted in the overlapping circles on a gray background. And the gray background is meant to be society. And the outer ring of society is labeled norms, to remind us that attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors really reinforce each other. In the center is a larger white circle with the word oppression, and surrounding that circle are overlapping circles with 6 specific forms of oppression. And this is really meant to highlight the ways that oppressions are linked and often experienced simultaneously. And I think this image helps us see that all forms of oppression are related and are root causes of the behaviors that then surround it. So John, if you'd go to the next slide, you'll see that, oops, so you'll go back one, I think. There we go. So the darker circles that are depicting things such as, you know, rape, kind of across the lifespan, different forms of sexual violence are typically things that, you know, we acknowledge, we see, we take them seriously. But as the circles are depicted in kind of lighter shades of gray all the way to white and no, Elizabeth, it's not ranking types of violence. It's more so just depicting, you know, these are things that we kind of are part of like national dialogues, but the lighter things are what we typically kind of don't take as seriously as a culture or as a society. They're kind of more hidden. And yet they're really the root. They're really part of that structure that Tori was pointing to in the slide with the tree, to be kind of like, these are the roots. John, if you go to the next slide, and yes, these slides are available for everyone. Tori, I'm gonna pass it back to you.
Thanks, Ashley. Sorry, I'm juggling. Where do I mute and unmute myself? Unfamiliar using a phone for web conferences, so I appreciate everyone, you know, letting us be imperfect on this web conference. So going back to this metaphor of the tree and the root causes, and what we see as a symptom of violence in our culture versus what is causing those symptoms to show up. We wanted to add another layer to this metaphor and talk about the soil. So the root causes that Ashley just walked us through, they don't exist in a vacuum or impact the world in a vacuum. And they're supported by what's going on around us in our systems and in our culture, and how those contribute to whether or not those root causes are things that we continue to allow. So we thought a really good way to visualize this was thinking about soil. So soil represents kind of what we all live in. We think about, you know, we're all breathing in the air of the culture, drinking the water of our culture, and there are things in it that are really, really harmful and that allow these root causes to continue to prosper. So when we think about the ways that these root causes come out, you know, we're going to go back to our metaphor and think about, you know, you can plant the same seed, but if they're in different soil and you plant the seed in a soil that's poisoned, that seed will not have the same opportunities to flourish as it would in soil that that is not poisoned. And it's not the seed's fault. There's nothing the seed could have done. We all know that. But if you plant the seed in supportive soil and nurture it and support it, that seed will have a very different life course. So when we think about our ability to change environments, it's so important to, again, zoom out a little bit further. And I feel like I keep going back to, okay, now we're zooming back out again, we're digging deeper, but here we go. That is what we are doing. You know, it's not just enough to see one part of the ecosystem. We need to be able to look at all of it and see, where is prevention happening? Are we people who can change the soil so that way these root causes that are super harmful, not just to sexual violence, but to all sorts of, you know, forms of violence, forms of harm that happen in our societies? Are we people who are changing the soil? Are we people who are digging up those roots? Are we people who are raking up the leaves? So thinking about, you know, where do we fall when we're talking about the prevention that we all do? And so if we move to the next slide, we want to see, you know, what do you all see as root causes of violence? What are the things in the soil that allow those root causes to continue? that are creating harm in your communities, and think too about what are those things that you can change. And Ashley, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Tori. So yeah, I think, as you kind of think about that, what are some of the roots that you're seeing? I want to move to the next slide, John, if you don't mind. So I don't know if you all are familiar with the book, The Body is Not an Apology. It's a book by Sonia Renee Taylor. Highly recommend it. But there's also an Instagram, and this image was on The Body is Not an Apology Instagram. And part of what the caption says is, what would it look like for the soil you're in to actually provide the nutrients and sustenance you require and desire? And so while this, I don't think the point of this was specifically thinking about violence prevention, but I thought it, really kind of reminded me of this conversation. Like, what would it look like if the soil of our communities, of our world, was actually providing people with nutrients instead of pollutants? John, if you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about the difference between awareness and prevention. And again, this is probably something that, you've spent a lot of time thinking about. But when I first started working at a community-based organization, I did a lot of educating and a lot of giving people information. And what I was doing was really important. Okay, that's important. I don't want to, make anyone think that that's not important, because it is. But what I have thought about a lot over the years was that it probably did stop short of actual prevention, right? And if we stick with the metaphor Tori walked us through with plants and soil, just telling people that the soil is bad and that it doesn't have the right nutrients, or even showing people how to kind of work with bad soil, it doesn't really actually change the soil, right? We're kind of just accepting that it's bad. And because we have that awareness, because we have that information, we're figuring out how to work with it. But when I think about prevention, I think about, what would happen if we actually made plans and did the work to change the soil? That would be true prevention. Instead of just making people aware of the problem of sexual violence, how can we also be thinking about how do we change the conditions that allow violence to happen in the first place? And so if we move to the next slide, I really like this quote from the Institute of Medicine, and I'll just read it. It says, "It is unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when so many forces in the social, cultural and physical environment conspire against such change. Ending sexual violence and intimate partner violence requires that people change their behaviors." But this quote makes me realize that in many ways, the behaviors that create harm and create harmful situations are actually rewarded socially and culturally, and sometimes are made to be the easy choice by the environments that we live in. All right, John, if you go to the next slide, you all may wonder, why are we looking at the food pyramid? And I don't know if you all can hear me because I just got kicked out of Zoom. Tori?
We can hear you. Yep, we can hear you.
So I'm going to go with it.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so would you all just humor me by, are you familiar with this image? If you just put like a yes in the text chat, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Okay. John, can you go back to the food pyramid? Thank you. All right, so if you all are familiar with this image, you know it's the food pyramid. But what was it supposed to tell us? Like, what was the point of someone creating the food pyramid? What do you all think? So someone said portion control, sales, balance, how much food group to eat, what could be healthy, creating healthy eating habits. Yeah, so I think that the development of the food pyramid was kind of, meant to provide education that, this is what we know about health and nutrition in terms of, this is what we know about nutrition. And so this is what, quote unquote, healthy meal would look like, right? So we're all very familiar with it. It's obviously changed a lot. Like, this is not used any longer, but it is something that is kind of like a relic from my childhood. And so through kind of this education that we've been given, we probably would say that we have a pretty good idea of what people have told us a healthy meal looks like, okay? So John, if you go to the next slide. So I'm getting personal with you all again, apologies. But so my knowledge, the information that I've been given, the education that I've received tells me that, I know that like maybe this is what a healthy breakfast would look like for myself, right? There's some protein, there's some veggies. That is what I have come to know. I have that knowledge. But John, if you'll move to the next slide, my environment tells me something very different. My environment, so this is a picture of a shopping center that if I were to leave my house and leave town, so like really to get anywhere, I would drive past McDonald's and Starbucks. And so even though I have the knowledge of what a healthy breakfast could look like, my environment is giving me a lot of other options. And so my behavior, can be swayed by some of these other options. Sometimes I'm running late. I don't have time to make a breakfast that I, think would be nutritious. And so the easy choice is a Starbucks or McDonald's. Sometimes I just feel like eating Starbucks or McDonald's. Sometimes I haven't been, able to get to the grocery store. Like, there's all of these different reasons why just having that information about what a healthy meal might look like doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to make that choice, right? I'm not going to make that choice. There's other things in my environment that are impacting my behavior. John, if you go to the next slide, you should see a little cartoon. So this cartoon is using a different public health issue. So it's focusing on diabetes. But I think it is a way to illustrate how environments impact behavior. And so we have our little cartoon person, Fred. So let's say that I am a doctor and Fred is one of my patients. I might tell Fred, hey, Fred, you need to adopt some healthy behaviors and you should do your best to stop the unhealthy ones so we can try to manage your diabetes. And as Fred's doctor, I might give Fred an easy to follow schedule for taking Fred's insulin. I might give Fred a brochure on healthy eating tips, but I'm not going home with Fred, right? I'm not going to be by Fred's side throughout the day as Fred is faced with decisions and behaviors. The fact is that Fred is part of a family and is part of a community and part of a culture that are also going to affect how Fred behaves. So to best help Fred, we also need to think about promoting healthy behaviors throughout Fred's environment. So for example, Fred, even though Fred has the knowledge that insulin will help him, wonder if Fred's family and friends also know his schedule and can help remind him. Fred may be more likely to eat healthy and fresh food if it's available in his neighborhood, right? If he has access to it. Fred might be more likely to get daily exercise that his doctor has encouraged if Fred has health insurance. And imagine if the health insurance included a gym membership. So there are lots of ways to support Fred throughout the environment that Fred lives, plays, and works in. And so, sexual violence and intimate partner violence is obviously more complex than this. But I think, this illustration kind of helps me see how our environment really impacts the way that we make decisions and our behaviors. And I saw, Audrey said, things have to be available and affordable. So there's a lot of reasons why just having knowledge won't actually change behavior, right? Is it available? Do you have access to it? There's so many different reasons. So thank you for letting me take you on that little journey. I'm wondering, and John, if you would move to the text chat question, what are some things in your environment that promote or prevent violence? And think about environment, I'd encourage, think about it broadly. And thanks, Madison. That's good to hear because we definitely question ourselves. We're like, are we going to make things more confusing? All right, so I'll let you all just respond to that. Tori, I want to pass it back to you. Were there things coming up in the text chat based on our other question that you wanted to pull out?
Well, before I do that, I want to, someone had just said, Jamie said when you were describing Fred's environment, Jamie made a really good connection to some policy stuff too. So that's something that we can think about with preventing sexual and intimate partner violence is how can policies that are also part of our environment shape and impact the behaviors that we all engage in. So shout out to Jamie for making that connection. And I'm scrolling up to our last text chat. So some of the things that people identified as roots. Julie identified male privilege and white supremacy as roots and pollutants being silence and comfortability. Other folks were saying things like poverty, family structure or family influence can be a big part of that complacency. Also, silence was coming up a lot for social norms for folks. Were there anything, Ashley, was there anything else that you saw coming up in the text chat?
I'm actually kind of digging through right now, so I will let you know.
Okay. Well, I think for the sake of time, we can move on. So, John, can you get us one more slide ahead? Great, thank you. So we want to talk about, when we're talking about an environment, I feel like the word environment itself has very different, brings up very different things for different people. You know, I have friends where when I'm talking about, oh, like this is going on in my environment, they think of like air, water, land, that physical environment. So again, more stories, more analogies. Thank you all for humoring us with these today. When we're talking about an environment, we're talking about the physical environment, but we're also talking about a social, cultural, economic, political environment. There's so many different things that go into what makes our atmospheres, our environments, what they are. And we know that the culture is a foundation of that, and the norms that impact the environment are built off of that culture. So you may be wondering why we're staring at my dog, other than she's really cute. When we think about environment, when Ashley and I were making this web conference, we thought of, think of a beach. And specifically, we're thinking of a California beach. What's the physical space like? What are the physical elements like? but also what are the social norms? So some of the social norms that I observed from this day at the beach with my dog were things like packing in and packing out. You know, there's not necessarily any signs about littering other than the ones like right when you enter the beach, but it's a social norm to not just, you know, leave your blankets, your towels, your trash on the beach after you're done. The culture on a California beach, it's very relaxed, it's playful, there's respect for the land and the water around you as well as your other beachgoers. And often you'll find people engaging in different beach activities and sports. Who told us that, you know, we play volleyball on the beach versus tennis? You know, that's something that is ingrained in our culture that, you know, without thinking, people just kind of associate things like volleyball and frisbee with beach activities versus other sports that folks could do. When you think of the economic environment that this beach in California exists in, thinking about the affordability and the accessibility, what is on the what's on the boardwalk, what's the parking situation or the parking infrastructure like, and also what's the policy on this beach as policies change on different beaches. This photo was actually taken just a few minutes after we had been asked to move just, you know, 15 feet away onto the other side of a sign that marked the dog-friendly versus not dog-friendly sides of the beach, and other things of policy like high tide warnings, or, you know, no swimming without a lifeguard or things like that. So this is all just to say that when we're talking about an environment, yes, we're talking about the McDonald's, the Starbucks, the land, the water, the air, but we're also talking about the social interactions that are specific to that environment. And without knowing it, we have kind of assigned what social interactions are appropriate in different environments without even thinking about it. And this also can change beach to beach. It can change, you know, for folks working in schools in one area, the environment of that school can be totally different. I think a lot of like, in the context of this metaphor that we're using when we're talking about a beach, I think of how my interaction at beaches in Oregon was very different than my interactions with beaches in Northern California versus beaches in Southern California. And they all have different, you know, holistic environments that are coming out in them. And this can be really similar for folks who are working in a school-based setting. A school in one county can have different social norms, culture, economic environments, and policies that impact sexual and intimate partner violence prevention versus a school in another county or even same district, different area. So it's really important to know what are all of these factors in our environment that are contributing to social norms that contribute to sexual and intimate partner violence. John, can you go to the next slide, please? So we've said it a lot, but what are we talking about when we're talking about social norms? Why are social norms as important as they are? I understand this reference is probably a little outdated because I sincerely hope that folks aren't subjected to crowded elevators right now during the pandemic. But, you know, one way to think about a social norm and the way that they have such a vast impact on our behavior is with how we behave when we get in elevators. What is appropriate space? Why are we facing front versus why are we facing other directions? So, you know, we think of like, why do we do these things? Why do we all behave in such similar ways when we enter on an elevator? And it's because we have certain social norms about what that behavior is. We also have certain social norms about how we behave in relation to sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. And social norms are things that we are all subjected to, but we also recognize that adolescents and young people are especially sensitive to social norms. And this is why it's so important when we think about preventing violence across the lifespan. John, can you move to the next slide, please? And so when we think about social norms change, we are aiming to change the attitudes, beliefs, and community values that folks have. And we can change those to be ones that protect against violence. And John, if you'll go to the next slide, when we're talking about norms that can prevent against violence, it's really, it can be really crucial to think about them in the context of the 5 key norms that Prevention Institute has provided. And many of these norms are things that you all have already brought up previously in the text chat with our other text chat questions. So we know that these are the categories of norms that really impact sexual and intimate partner violence, being a culture of violence, narrow definitions of masculinity, limited roles for women. A lot of those 3, as well as power and control and privacy and silence, were things that you all were already bringing up in the text chat earlier. So really appreciate that. And I'm also gonna drop the link in the chat for these 5 key norms for folks to explore as well. So these are the social norms that uphold conditions that contribute to violence and harmful social norms. But they're also norms that we have the power to change, that we have the power to alter and create environments, create conditions in which violence cannot occur. And Ashley, I think you have a really good example on the next slide, so I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think there's definitely a connection between the norm of privacy and silence and how a lot of times when folks talk about sexual violence, there tends to be a focus on kind of individual experiences of sexual violence. So like there's, lots of private, experience that this person had. Instead of seeing sexual violence as really a community issue and a culture that kind of supports and upholds and protects sexual violence. I think when we allow privacy and silence, we hide patterns of abuse. We hide the context that violence happens in. And we also kind of hide or we don't call to attention the things that contribute to violence, that condone violence and that ignore violence. And so, really shifting from that norm of privacy and silence to like, this is just, something that happened to like an individual to this is an actual community issue is one way to push back against that norm. And John, if you'd go to the next slide for the polling question, are you able to launch that?
We'll see. Thanks everybody for being along on this ride. Cross your fingers. I'm clicking launch poll right now.
It worked.
Awesome.
So hopefully a poll window popped up. We're just wondering, which of those kind of 5 key norms that were pulled out do you feel you have the most power in being able to change to prevent violence? And it's actually, I'm kind of watching how people are voting right now, and it's exciting to see that people are selecting all of them differently, of course, but we have it's about 40% of people who have responded. Sorry, I don't know if you want to go ahead and share the results. Yeah, so you'll see that culture of violence was the most selected, but followed closely behind looking at narrow definitions of masculinity, power and control, privacy and silence was the second one, and then power and control and limited roles for women. So thank you. We'll take that off your screen. And then John, if you'd move to the next slide. So, you know, when we would go one back, thank you. All right. Nope, the one with the little water drop. So when we're thinking about preventing sexual and intimate partner violence, you know, we can go back to our very first story, our moving upstream story, and think about how can we have the biggest impact? Like, what are the things that we can think about having an impact in that will have the biggest impact? We can think about, you know, how do we move from reaching individual people to being able to impact larger communities of people. And so here I go again. This isn't a perfect analogy because violence is a much more complex issue, but think with me for a moment about the use of seatbelts in cars. You know, I don't think that getting in a car and putting on a seatbelt right away was always a norm, but through a combination of education and policy and marketing, it really has become a norm. You know, but to my knowledge, there's not people who are super passionate about seatbelt use trying to reach individuals about the importance of seatbelts, right? Like, there's not necessarily like workshops done on seatbelt use, but instead we have these broader impact things like policies and marketing tools, like signs on the highway, that have had an impact on our behavior. And so, you know, what are things that we can do to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence that have those larger impacts, right? Things that impact the entire community that people don't actually have to participate in to be impacted by. And John, if you go to the next slide, you know, we had this like really critical contribution to the anti-sexual violence movement and dialogue around sexual violence with Tarana Burke and the Me Too movement. I mean, you know, Me Too has helped people see the scope of the problem in such a huge way, in such a public way. Me Too has really been able to spark an increase in awareness and has helped to shift that norm of privacy and silence to one where people, you know, survivors are feeling more, I don't know if I want to say empowered, but just feel that they can share their story, that they can say that this happened to them, and that people are listening and taking that in. And so the next step is prevention is really asking us, what do we have to do so that no one ever has to say Me Too again, right? Like, what are those things that we have to do? So Tori, I'd love to pass it over with you. I know with our tech problems, we're running short on time, but I think this is going to help kind of wrap up our conversation today with some of those examples.
Yeah, of course. Happy to go through those as efficiently as I can, making up for lost time. So, Ashley, what you had just talked about with, you know, how do we reach the most amount of people? How do we reach people in ways that they experience the benefits of preventing violence without ever having to be in, they don't necessarily have to be in a violence prevention education workshop or classroom or anything like that. You know, how do we have that mass impact? And I think one of the ways that we have seen people engage in this conversation is talking about economic supports that prevent against violence. And I put a link in the chat. We did a fantastic web conference with folks in July talking about how do we message these connections between economic policy and support and preventing violence. And so I encourage folks to check that out. Megan Simmons with Ujima Inc. just does an incredible job of connecting all of these different economic policies to the ways that they prevent against violence. The example you see on your screen is from One Fair Wage, where the folks at One Fair Wage have identified that restaurant workers are at a significantly higher risk of experiencing sexual harassment and violence, particularly now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing that policymakers can do that would support them both economically and preventing that harassment and violence would be to end the tipped minimum wage. So by allowing people some of that economic freedom from being subjected to, you know, people acknowledging, like, if I don't give you tip money, you can't make rent this month, by having some of that economic support given directly to the workers versus through tips, that can help prevent harassment and violence. And John, can you move to the next slide, please? So that's one example of policy, and there are some others that we've seen in the last few years that are also supporting violence prevention as well. One of them being the Ya Basta Promotoras out of California, being able to host their own violence prevention programming. And that's something really powerful for engaging communities and you know, having folks be empowered in sexual violence prevention, and also being able to create and deliver content that they know is most relevant to their own lived experiences. And another example, again, we have another web conference from last year, I believe, talking about how paid leave can also be a policy that leads to preventing violence. Again, these things like policy and economic supports, these are things that can prevent violence for folks that, you know, maybe have never thought about sexual violence before, but they're still receiving those benefits of it. So it's important that we talk about, you know, these broad examples and make those connections as briefly as we are right now. John, can you go to the next slide, please? Another thing to think about with these broad impact violence prevention programs are things like social inclusion. The folks in Indiana did a great job talking about how they changed their physical environment to be more inclusive and accessible of folks with disabilities in their community, so they felt more connected to their other community members. And again, I'm pasting links to web conferences for folks to find more information on this, because I know we're going through it very quickly. Another great example is from Líderes Campesinas. Their mission is to strengthen the leadership of farm worker women to be agents of social, economic, and political change to ensure their human rights. And they organize youth in different arts projects to talk about preventing violence in their communities too. So empowering youth to be leaders where they can influence other youth in their lives that, again, may or may not necessarily be involved in the art projects, but they're still having an impact on preventing violence in their community. I know we have 1 minute left. John, can you move to the next slide? We want to leave this with you all to think about. Acknowledging that for folks who are new to prevention, you're probably already doing things. You're looking back at this web conference and thinking, wait a second, this is what I do in my daily life to change social norms that cause violence into social norms that protect against and prevent violence. So we want to honor the wisdom that you all brought into this web conference today. Think about it, respond in the text chat if you feel so inclined. What are you already doing to prevent violence in your communities? And what are you excited to do to prevent violence in your communities? Ashley, I know that we are out of time. So I'm thinking, John, can you go to the next slide, please? We have quite a few resources for folks with both PCARD and SBRC's e-learning courses. Next slide, please. As well as our own with Prevent Connect. So I am happy to send these out in our evaluation email, just so folks have access to all of these resources for later. But Ashley, I'm going to hand it back over to you to close us out and give us your parting words for today.
Thank you, Tori. Do I have words left? Let's see. Well, I just want to thank you all so much for joining us, for being so willing to participate in this conversation and share your insights and your experiences. And the things that you're doing, also for extending that grace to Tori and I as we work through some tech issues. You know, we have been doing web conferences for 15 years on Prevent Connect, and for the last year, we have not had any tech issues, I don't think. Probably shouldn't have said that, but it's kind of amazing that we've gotten that far without that. So thank you all so much for joining us. John, you are the MVP. Thank you for helping your colleagues. But we're just, you know, so grateful to you all. We hope this has been helpful. We will be doing a repeat of this session in January, and we are excited to say that we are going to be able to offer Spanish interpretation for that web conference. So that's really exciting because that is something that Prevent Connect, to my knowledge, has not done. So thank you all so much. Please take care and feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. There is an evaluation survey that you'll receive following this. At the end of that, there is a certificate of attendance that you can access. If you have any trouble with that, feel free to email Tori or myself. We appreciate you all so much, and we will see you in 2021. Take care, everyone.